ladies and gentlemen, welcome on the 10th meeting of Polish SAS Users Group. Our guest today is Quentin McMullen. Quentin is a seasoned SAS user. He has more than 20 years of experience in SAS programming. He programs in the clinical trials, healthcare, and related areas. Quentin is very active member of SAS communities. You can meet him at communities.sas.com, SASL, Stack Overflow, and if you have questions, there's like big chance that one of the people who help you to solve your problem is Quentin. And Quentin also is a chair of steering committee of the Boston Area SAS Users Group, BASUG. So I already mentioned BASUG webpage, so check it out. The BASUG community is very powerful, very strong, and they've got very rich set of events, SAS events happening in the future. Quentin and the team works very hard to make it super cool. And you can see this is the more or less map of the world. We are sitting either more or less here in Rhode Island. The Quentin sits here, and I'm sitting here in Warsaw, Poland. And we'll be able to hear Quentin's talk today. And Quentin, the floor is yours. Let's start. And I will turn off my camera, and the microphone is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Bart. And excuse me. Thanks for the invitation for speaking today. I was saying before that now I get to claim that I'm an international speaker for being here at PolSUG. So thank you for that, and thanks for the plug of BASUG. Certainly, it's an exciting group, and we've got a great steering committee, and we're really excited about our new website and all of our upcoming events. So today, my presentation is a paper I actually did for Global Forum 2 years ago that Bart helped me with, but it's actually my first time getting to present it. So thanks again for that opportunity. Taking a close look at how DOSUBL handles macro variable scopes. So I've been programming in SAS, as Bart said, for 20 years or so, and I think of myself as a SAS programmer, and I end up being a lot of a macro programmer, right? So one of the fun things I get to do is write these function style macros that are nice little utilities to have to create just a little piece of SAS code, right? So a function style macro or a macro function, its job is to generate part of a statement, not a full statement, not a step, what have you. Okay? So if I've got a macro like expand var list, whose job it is just to read in a data set and return a list of variables. This is a utility macro that I have, use it all the time, and it's handy, right? So you can say put expand var list of this thing, and it'll return all that list of variables. You can use this inside of a data set because all it's doing is returning that list of variables as a string or as text and doing the code substitution, right? So macro functions are very handy. And if you think about what that macro is doing, you'd think, well, it's just running proc contents, getting the variable list, and returning that list. But in fact, the golden rule of programming macro functions when you start is your macro functions can't execute any SAS statements, right? They can only execute macro statements. So people give that rule different ways. Like you can't have any SAS statements in your macro function. You can't have any SAS semicolons. But the idea is basically your macro functions have to be pure SAS code. So that macro expand var list that you might have thought would be like proc contents can't be because a macro function can't run proc contents. At least it couldn't before DOSUBL. So here's how this macro function looks, that I've got in my autocall library. Because it can't run proc contents, it uses %sysfunc to call these SCL functions to do all the work. And it works. You can use %sysfunc to open the data set, and then you can find out how many variables there are in the data set, and then you can loop over that number of variables and find the name of the ith variable in the data set, put that all into a macro variable, and at the end return it, right? So this is all pure macro code for the purpose of getting that variable list and then returning it, and it works fine, and it works. And this is how I do it right now. But it's kind of ugly code if you're not a big fan of %sysfunc and SCL. And more importantly, it's like it's not how you think of it natively as a SAS programmer, when all you really want to do is just run proc contents or maybe proc SQL to read from a dictionary table. So until about 2012, that way I just showed with the SCL functions was the only way you could do this kind of thing. It's always dangerous to say only way, but I think the only way you could do that in SAS with a macro function. 2012, Mike Rhodes wrote this paper, Use the Full Power of SAS in Your Function Style Macros. And this paper was game-changing. So I read this paper a couple years late, and he had a way using proc FCMP and run macro, and Bart, you could explain it better than I could, but he found a way using those two new tools to get around this limitation of not being able to run SAS code in a function style macro. So he could write a function style macro using this approach that could run a whole proc step or a few proc steps. And I read the paper and I thought, wow, this is, as a macro programmer, as a macro developer, this is really game changing. And I emailed Mike and said, Mike, you know, how did you come up with this? This is amazing. You've changed everything. And he said, thanks, Quentin. But if you like that paper, you should read this paper by Rick Langston, Submitting SAS Code on the Side. So in 2013, Rick wrote that paper, and Rick's the developer who gave us DOSUBL. Because one of the things that DOSUBL gives us is the ability to do that same thing that Mike had done, that is the ability to have a macro function which actually executes SAS code, SAS statements, and SAS procs without breaking the outer code. And I read Rick's paper, and I don't know what I said the first time. If my head was blown the first time, if I was surprised the first time by Mike's paper, when I read Rick's paper, I was like amazed. I really think it's a game changer. I really think DOSUBL is a game changer for macro programmers and for SAS. And I think I've been disappointed. I haven't seen more use of DOSUBL, more papers about it since 2013. So this is partly DOSUBL exploration on my part and partly DOSUBL advocacy, I guess, this talk. So here's the look of expand var lists with the SCL functions, the old way. With DOSUBL, all you need basically is two statements. Well, a local statement is always a good idea here. In the macro, I say, let RC equals %sysfunc, so still sysfunc, call the DOSUBL, and I'm going to pass it some code. And the code it passes is sort of what I imagined the code would have been all the time. Just run proc contents, and then to output the variable list to a data set, run proc contents on the data to output a data set, and then use proc SQL to read that variable list and read it into a macro variable called var names and return it, right? So with DOSUBL, I can write plain SAS code that I know how to write to do whatever logic I want. And somehow this code can execute as a macro function without breaking my main SAS code. And that's the magic of DOSUBL. So here, if you think about this code here, suppose that I run this step here with the DOSUBL macro function. SAS is going to start compiling this step, right? So the compiler starts, it compiles this, it sees this, and boom, it sees this %sign. Great. Calls the macro, so it pauses compiling the step, calls the macro processor. Macro processor executes this macro. That's all normal stuff, right? It hits the DOSUBL, and the DOSUBL creates this magical side session of SAS, right? So in SAS, you're always in your main session. DOSUBL creates a side session. You can think of it like a child session, which can actually run code. So while this step here in my main session is compiling, DOSUBL creates a separate child session, which can then generate this code and execute it. This code runs in the side session, then writes the macro variable var names and returns var names here so that this works. Okay. So when you look at this, a couple of things are apparent. Or the main thing that's apparent to me is that, I mean, the first is I really do feel like it's magic here, this idea of automatically generating this side session, right? This side session needs a way, though, to resolve macro variables, data and var, that exist in the main session. And also, the side session creates this macro variable var names. It needs a way to write that macro variable back to the main session so that it can resolve over here. And when I realized that, that's what made me think about, like, well, the macro language is complex enough in terms of symbol tables and global and local variables, et cetera. But having this side session introduces a whole new sort of set of scoping rules that, as a macro programmer, I need to understand if I want to use DOSUBL safely. Now, to be clear, that old rule of macro functions still holds, right? The rule is your function style macro must only have macro statements. And that's true even with DOSUBL, right? This macro has two statements. It has a local statement and a let statement, and that's it. There's a block of SAS code here, but to the macro language, it never sees this as code. This is just text because it's wrapped in this %nr string. So we just get text that gets sent off to DOSUBL. So a disclaimer, I would say that, like, most papers are written by an expert in a topic, and I'm definitely not an expert in DOSUBL. What I've been doing basically is investigating DOSUBL in hopes of figuring out, like, how does it handle a macro variable scope? Like, I know there must be some rules for it. It's a program. What are the rules for handling macro variable scope? And so what I'll present today is illustrating what I've deduced about the macro scope rules of DOSUBL. But, like, honestly, some of my deductions might be wrong. So I'd encourage you to explore DOSUBL on your own. And if you do, please do write some papers. Okay. First example, which isn't DOSUBL, but just a macro example to show sort of the framework that I'll be using. So we know that every SAS session has a global symbol table, right? Most macros create a local symbol table. It's possible to write a macro that doesn't have a local symbol table, but it's usually a bad idea. And when %let executes within a macro, the language has rules for deciding, should I write this new variable to the local table or a global table? And similarly, when you resolve a macro variable, there are rules in the language to say, should I resolve this macro variable from the local table or the global table, right? So here's the setup of all of my examples. On the left here is a block of SAS code that we'll walk through. On the right here is a global symbol table, and other symbol tables that are created will be added up here. And the bottom here is a log for showing our put statements. So in the sample code here, I create two global macro variables, A and B, and then I'm going to compile a macro called try, and then run the macro try, and we'll basically walk through and watch where variables get written to. Okay, so this is simple, not DOSUBL, just simple macro rules. I shouldn't say simple. This is macro language rules to begin with. So let A equals A global executes and writes it to the global table. Same thing for B. This macro then compiles. When you call the macro try, it creates a local symbol table for try. The %local statement there creates the local variable B and puts it into the local table try. Let B equals B local, right? So there's that first rule of the macro language. SAS needs to decide when he says let B equals B local, where do I write that? And the rules of macro language say, if it exists in a local table, write it there. So B local goes to that local symbol table instead of colliding with the global version, right? Put user runs, and it shows you the variables from both symbol tables. So there'll be a lot of put user in this talk. So you can see the B that's local and the A and B that are global. But if you put just amper A or amper B, they resolve again according to the rules, right? It's the innermost macro variable that gets returned. So A resolves to A global, but B resolves to B local because there's a local macro variable B. So that's the sort of overview of just usual macro language scoping rules. So as I mentioned before, DOSUBL creates this side session to execute code, and the side session actually has its own global symbol table. So you're used to thinking about your global symbol table, your main session, and a local symbol table, or even multiple local symbol tables. But DOSUBL side session gets its own global symbol table and also could have its own local symbol table. And when code executed in the side session runs, it can resolve macro variables from any 4 of those tables, the side session, global, local, or your main global and local. And the side session can also write macro variables to all 4 of those tables. So that's what I mean when I say, like, it's almost like doubling the complexity of macro scoping, because you go from having 1 global table and 1 often local table to now having 4 tables you need to think about. So let's look at the first DOSUBL example, just to show that code executed by DOSUBL can resolve main session macro variables. So same example as before, but now inside of the macro here try, we use DOSUBL to execute the put statement that says put user and put amper A and amper B. Okay. One thing to note here is that in my intro slides, I showed DOSUBL being called using %sysfunc. So it's %sysfunc, DOSUBL, %nr string, etc. In these examples, I use a data step calling DOSUBL, but there's no difference in how DOSUBL functions. It's just that I thought the code would be clearer if I didn't have all the parentheses from %sysfunc and %nr string. So the key point here is that all of this text here, the code here, which is an argument to DOSUBL, gets passed to that side session where it will execute. Okay. So when I walk through this code, as before, it creates 2 global macro variables at the beginning. This macro will compile. Try creates its local symbol table. Now we're executing the macro try. The local statement creates B. B local goes there. And now the data null step starts to execute. And when DOSUBL runs, put user shows all 3 of those variables. So it looks just like it did in the first example, right? The point here is this code that's running the side session can see your main session symbol tables. Similarly, put A and B returns A global and B local, just like it did if you were running in the main session. So at this point, I guess there's no reason for you to believe me that there is a side session or a separate table at all, because the results are the same as we saw originally. But the next example will show how I deduced that there was a separate table. So for now, the point is just that we know that the side session, if you believe me that it's there, it can resolve macro variables in the usual way. So second example, looking at how DOSUBL can write macro variables and how does it decide where to write them when DOSUBL is called in open code. So if you just code DOSUBL and say let x equals 1, the language has rules for deciding where to write it. And the rule is, if your main session global symbol table has a variable named x, then that DOSUBL statement, then that let x equals 1 statement executing in the side session is going to update the value of x in your main session global symbol table. If the main session does not have a variable called x already in its global symbol table, then it's going to write x to that separate side session global symbol table. And then when DOSUBL completes, it's going to return x from the side session to the main session. And that's a lot of words, so I'll show you the example. So here we start the same way with the 2 let statements to write A and B to the global symbol table. Now, when this data null, when the DOSUBL runs in this data null, it creates a separate global symbol table for the side session. So that's what you got here. So now you've got this is the main global symbol table and the side session global symbol table. When this let b equals b side runs, it needs to decide where to write to. And it looks to see, is there a global session variable named b? And there is. So it writes it to b side. Sorry, it writes it to global, updating its value to become b side. When let c equals executes, it looks to see if there's a global macro variable named c already in the main session global symbol table, but there's not. So it writes it to the separate side session global symbol table. Okay. This put user then shows you these results: global, C, A, and B. So if you think about this log, this was one of the first clues to me something weird was happening, because I noticed, like, well, this is weird. How come these variables aren't in alphabetical order? Normally, with a put user statement, there would be an alphabetical order within the scope. And then I realized that the key rule there is about it's alphabetical within scope. So if you look up the definition, the documentation for put user, it will tell you that it returns your variables in scope order and alphabetically within that. So if there was a local symbol table, that would be listed first, and then your global. So the fact that these are out of order alphabetically here is actually evidence for my claim that there's a separate global side session symbol table. That is, this variable C is in the global scope of the side session. These variables A and B are in the global scope of the main session. They're actually in two different scopes, which is why they're reported this way alphabetically, with C first and then A and B. When DOSUBL completes, it needs to get rid of this global symbol table in the side session, because DOSUBL creates the side sessions, all the objects it needs for that, but when it completes executing, it destroys everything, right? So it's got to decide what to do with this variable C that it created. It's going to return it to the main session. In this case, the only place it has to return it is that global symbol table. So when DOSUBL completes, after this step, you'll actually have A, B, and C there in your usual main session global symbol table. So that second put user down here shows A, B, and C in the same order. Why? Well, because now they're all in the same scope. They're all in your main session global symbol table. This next example looks at writing macro variables when DOSUBL is called inside of a macro. So in this setting, you've got a macro in your main session, and you call DOSUBL inside of that macro, right? So there are different rules for this setting, because now you've got the potential, and you probably have in your main session a global macro variable, a global macro symbol table, and a local symbol table in your main session. And so DOSUBL has more decisions to make about where to write to. So when DOSUBL is called inside of a macro, this let x equals 1 will always write x to the side session global symbol table. It's actually a little bit easier in this setting, because you know if you're in a macro and you call DOSUBL, any variables created, they're going to be written to that side session global symbol table. And then when DOSUBL completes, it needs to return x to the main session, but this is where the decision comes in. It needs to know, should I return this macro variable x to the main session global symbol table or to a local symbol table? And the rule it uses is, it says, if that macro variable x exists in a main session local symbol table, then it's going to get returned to the most local symbol table that exists. If x does not exist in any local symbol table, then x gets returned to be global. So here's this example. You say usual setup by now. You make A and B as two global macro variables in your main session. Compile the macro try. Run try makes your local symbol table. Local B goes there. And now we run DOSUBL. And DOSUBL creates its side session global symbol table. And it's going to run these three statements to write values to A, B, and C. Because DOSUBL was called inside of a macro, all three of these are going to go right to the side session global table. They're not going to collide with these. So A goes to the side session global table, B goes there, and C. When the side session runs put user, you can again see all three of these scopes. You see the global session, the global table from the side session, the local table from the main session, and the global table from the main session. So again, more evidence of my claim that I think it's clear, more clear here that you've got three different scopes. You've got a global scope for the side session, which is different than the global scope for the main session. So put user sees all 6 of those variables. Now when DOSUBL completes, it's got to decide what to do with these variables, A, B, and C. So it says, where should I put A? It looks to see if it exists in a local table. It doesn't, so it sends it to the global table. So A comes back to your global symbol table. What do I do with B? It sees it does exist in the A local symbol table. So B is going to come back as a local variable. And then it looks at C. C doesn't exist in a local table. So C comes back as a global macro variable. And then DOSUBL is done, so its side session gets destroyed, right? Everything about the side session goes away. Right. So that put user then, if you run it again now outside of DOSUBL, this put user runs in your main session inside of the macro. It will show you that try has the value of B side, and it will show you the 3 global macro variables. Because now the side session is all gone, it's just the usual result. So the point here is that when you make a global macro variable in your side session, those macro variables at the end of DOSUBL will get returned to your main session, and you need to know where are they getting returned. In this case, 2 of them came back as global macro variables, and 1 came back as local. Right? So another example, a little bit more complex. In this case, we're inside of a macro in our main session, but DOSUBL calls a macro. Okay. So the side session code is calling a macro. That macro variable x or foo is going to be written to either a side session local symbol table or the side session global symbol table. And code executing the side session can resolve macro variables from all 4 scopes: side session local, side session global, main session local, main session global. And as before, when DOSUBL completes, those side session global macro variables get returned to your main session, assuming that there's no local variable with the same name. So here's this example. So in this setup, our main code is, again, we've got a macro called try, which creates a local macro variable and then calls DOSUBL. DOSUBL calls a macro called makevars, and that macro variable makevars basically has a global statement, a local statement, and then writes values. So the key difference here is now DOSUBL isn't getting hard-coded code. DOSUBL is actually getting a macro call, And of course, this macro call then can create as its own local symbol table. So here, let statement runs, the macro try compiles, make vars compiles, try executes, creates its local symbol table. The local statement executes and writes the value of b main to b. Great. DOSUBL executes, creates the side session global symbol table, and make vars executes. So one point worth noting here is that this works. That is, this call to make vars is happening in this child session, the side session code. Make vars was actually compiled in our main session, but the child session is able to call this macro that was compiled in the main session. And it turns out they don't actually share the same SAS macro catalog, work.sas macro or whatever it is, but the child session, the side session can read macros that have been compiled in your main session. So one bit of good news is that this works. So now make vars executes. It creates its own local symbol table there in the side session. Now the global statement executes. So again, this code's running in the side session. You've got a statement global A, and that global statement is referring to the global table of the side session. So A goes there. Okay. Local B goes to the local table of make vars. And now if you say let A equals A side, that goes to the global side session table. B equals B side goes to the local side session table. Put user running in this side session can now see all four of those scopes. It sees a local side session, the global table of the side session, the local of the main session, and the global symbol table of your main session. When this macro make vars completes, the local table goes away, right? Because that's what they do. Local tables go away when the macro complete. Now we're back up here, and DOSUBL needs to complete, and it's got to deal with this macro variable A and A side. So it does the look to see, is there a local variable named A? Nope, there's not. So I'll return it here to the global symbol table. It must be that he wants it to go to the global symbol table. And then the DOSUBL is done, the side session goes away, and we're done. And this is nice because as a macro programmer, you're often thinking about how can I return a macro variable from here to there? What's the best way to do that within the scoping rules? So we see that DOSUBL can create a global macro variable and can return it to your main session global table. But the problem is also that as a macro programmer, global macro variables are very problematic. Most macro programmers want to deal with local macro variables because they're compartmentalized, less chance of collisions, lots of reasons. So what I really wanted when I tried this was a way to say, okay, I want to have make vars create a global macro variable in the side session, but I want that to be returned to the local scope of try, right? So rather than having A side go up here, I'd like to have it come down here, basically, yeah, to the local symbol table. Oh, sorry, I skipped a step. That step was just to show you that put user works in your main session. Okay. So I tried to make it so that I could get the DOSUBL code to return to the local symbol table. And my first attempt failed, but it failed in an interesting way. So here's the code. And the only change I made was to say that in this case, before I had A as being global and B as being local, I thought, well, I'll make B global here. This should create a side session global macro variable B equal to B side. And I know that if I can create a side session global macro variable B, when DOSUBL ends, it will return it to my main session. So walking through this code, make the macro variable A, compile this macro, call try, local symbol table, local B does its usual thing, DOSUBL creates the global side table, the global symbol table of the side session, make vars runs, so far so good. Make vars makes its local symbol table in the side session, global A runs, goes up there to the side session global symbol table, right where I wanted it to be. Global B runs, and I'm thinking this should write it right up here in the global session global side table like the last one, but instead I get an error. Error, attempt to present global a name B in this case, which exists in a local environment. And first I was frustrated, but then I stopped to think about this error. Like, what does this error mean? And I think that, see what happened there? I pulled up the chat for a second and I clicked too far. All right, what does this error mean? Normally this error means that if you've got a global macro variable, if you've got a local macro variable called B, so you're in a macro, right? If you then execute within that macro percent global B, it doesn't make sense in main SAS, because if SAS let you create a global macro variable B at the same time as there was a local macro variable B in existence somewhere, you would never be able to use that global macro variable B, because the main scoping rules of the macro language are you use the most local one. So if you had local B and somehow use a global statement to create global B, and then said let B equals 1, you'd always be writing to your local one. And if you try to read B, you'll always be reading from the local one. So fine. So SAS says, okay, we'll give them this error message to prevent our macro developers from doing something stupid. Because if they try to create a global macro variable, if there's a local macro variable existing, and they try to create a global macro variable at the same time, nothing good will come from that. So this is a good rule. It's a good error message in general for the macro language. But in this case, I think this error message doesn't know about DOSUBL, because I'm trying to create a global macro variable B here in this side session symbol table. And this side session symbol table is actually more local than the main session local symbol table. So what I'm trying to do, I think, should be allowed. That is, this global statement should create global B here. And if I tried to, and then when I say let B equals B side, it would, if it had created it, it would write it there, which is what I want. So I was frustrated by this error message because, as I say, I hate global macro variables. But then I thought about it and I was like, well, there's other ways to create a global macro variable besides the global statement, right? Like even just an open let can create a global macro variable. So here's the workaround that I came up with for that then. So again, the goal here is to create a macro variable in the side session that will get returned to the local symbol table. So I'll just walk through the code. Usual, let A equals A main. This macro compiles. This macro compiles. I call %try, local symbol table. Local B gets written to there. And now DOSUBL comes. It creates the global side session table, the global side session symbol table. And now I know I can't use a global statement because if I do, it's going to just say global B because of that error. But if I just say here inside of DOSUBL, let B equals nothing, that creates a side session macro variable named B, right? Because that let statement is running in the side session in open code. It doesn't know that it's inside of a macro. It's just a let statement that's running in the side session. It creates the global macro variable B with no value. Now I can call make vars, which gets its own local scope. Down here, I still have the global A from before. Okay, that's going to create that variable A there in the side session, right? I mean, I'm lucky here that there didn't happen to be a local macro variable named A, because if there was, I would have gotten an error. But because there's not, I can get away with that global statement there. Now, let A equals A side goes up there, and now let B equals B side goes up to that side session table where I wanted it. So by creating B as a global macro variable with this let statement up here, then this let statement out here basically follows the normal rules, which is if it exists locally, it would have written to it. It didn't, so it looked out here and it saw, oh, it exists here in the global session side scope, so it writes to it. So now I've got what I wanted to get in terms of getting B to be in the side session global symbol table. Put user again sees all three of those scopes that we have. When the macro completes, the symbol table goes away. When DOSUBL completes, it needs to return A and B back to the main session. For A, it looks to see where should I return it. It doesn't exist locally, so it's going to return it to the global symbol table. But for B this time, it looks to see, does it exist locally? Yes, it does. So it gets returned to the local symbol table, B side, which was my goal, right? So like if this was a real macro here, I wouldn't be messing around with this global A at all. I would be coding everything so that I'm okay with them being created global in the side session because it's temporary and encapsulated as it is. But they get returned. The key part is to get them created global in the side session so that I can get them returned as local in my main session, right? I definitely don't want things magically appearing in my global symbol table of my main session because I'm anti-global macro variables as a matter of philosophy. Then the DOSUBL completes, that whole symbol table goes away. Put user shows you what's remaining now in your symbol tables. And that's it. So I guess that's probably a lot of examples. I think at a high level, as you think about DOSUBL, if you're a macro programmer, there's a few things you need to sort of think about and understand, right? The key thing is to understand, like, how does %let, when you call %let in your DOSUBL side session, how does %let determine which symbol table to write to? How do macro variable references in that DOSUBL side session, how do they resolve? And when DOSUBL completes, it returns side session global macro variables to your main session. So you need to understand where they get returned to. So here are the rules that I've come up with. How does let foo equals 1 determine which global symbol table to write to? So let's say when DOSUBL executes let foo equals 1, how does it determine which to write to? If DOSUBL was called in open code, then I have to do some tests. It says, if foo exists already in the side session global symbol table, then update it. Else, if foo exists in the main session table, then update it. And if not, it will create foo in that side session global symbol table. If DOSUBL was called inside of a macro, it's simpler. It just always says, creating a global macro variable, just write it to the side session global symbol table. And I actually think it would have been easier to understand if that was just a rule in general. Side session creates a global macro variable, just write it to this global symbol table. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Sometimes it writes it to the main session global symbol table. How do macro variable references in that DOSUBL side session, how do they resolve? It's pretty straightforward once you understand the concept of there being these additional tables, right? When references in the side session resolve, the macro processor searches them in order, starting with the side session local symbol table or symbol tables, then the side session global symbol table, then the main session local symbol table, and finally the main session global symbol table. So it's that same set of rules we're used to with a macro language where you imagine these nested scopes of global and then local, and you can have more locals in there. You just add a layer where you've got main session global, inside of that locals, and then inside of that side session global, and inside of that side session locals. How does DOSUBL determine which symbol table to return those global macro variables foo to? So I said, when DOSUBL ends, any side session global macro variables get returned to the main session. And the rule is, if that macro variable foo, if it exists in any main session local symbol table, it will write foo to the most local symbol table that exists. If foo does not exist in any local table in your main session, then it becomes global. This also is not like the rule that I would have picked if I was trying to come up with this, how this should work. And because I like local macro variables, I would have just said, anything get returned, make it local. Or more like the usual macro rule, when you return a macro variable, if it exists in any scope, return it to the innermost scope where you find it. Right? Because this rule isn't quite that, because it says, it's actually, if you imagine you have got two different local scopes, if you had nested local scopes, this rule says, okay, if foo exists in either of the local scopes, then return it to the most local scope that is there. So you can actually end up with a local macro variable foo in like local scope number 2. You create the macro variable foo in your side session, and it ends up getting returned to a more local scope than you expect. But this is what I think the rules are. So with that summary aside, I think in my head, like, I've just been trying to figure out this stuff because the documentation on DOSUBL is fairly sparse. I think there's a lot more still to figure out about DOSUBL, right? I mean, again, keep this idea of your main session and your side session. So any global construct object of your SAS session, which you know about, you've got a question, well, how does that work with this magical side session? So like system options. If I change a system option in my main session and I use DOSUBL to create a side session, does it inherit that option? If I change an option in the side session, does that change come back to my main session? Or even stuff like titles and footnotes, right? How do they work? Because titles are global session things. Are the titles, is there one set of titles and footnotes for both sessions, or are they independent? And from testing before some of the options, I quickly got confused because it seemed like most of the options got inherited, but some of them didn't. Some things that I changed in the side session came back and others didn't. Like even macro variables, like the automatic macro variables, amper sysair and amper syscc and those things. Lots of people use those to check a step, to the step work. But if the side session code errors, it will set amper sysair or syscc in the side session, but those automatic macro variables didn't come back to the main session. So my point is, there's a lot worth exploring about DOSUBL and how it manages all the magic that it can work. So in conclusion, I would say DOSUBL is very cool. Like, I mean, it literally makes things possible that were never possible before. I meant to say early on, it's like, you can think about DOSUBL as like call execute on steroids. I mean, call execute can't actually execute SAS code. It generates it for the most part. Data step code, certainly, right? Call execute can't execute a data step. Because of that rule, you can never have two steps executing at the same time. With DOSUBL, it can do that. With DOSUBL, you can have a macro function that runs a data step. You can have a data step that runs another data step at the same time as this step is running. So it's really cool. If you're a macro programmer, you need to understand the macro variable scoping rules of DOSUBL. And the key point is to keep in mind this idea that the side session has its own table, global symbol table, and those macro variables will get returned to your main session when DOSUBL completes. So again, I'd encourage you all to play with DOSUBL, particularly any macro programmers out there, And I do think that as a SAS community, like we need more DOSUBL papers. I don't think there were any DOSUBL papers at Global Forum this year. And I think last year, I mean, I had one. I think the year before, maybe there was one, but I would say we need more papers on DOSUBL. I think it's, the lots of overlooked corners of SAS. I think DOSUBL is one of them. So thank you all for listening. I do want to acknowledge a bunch of folks who helped me with this paper. A bunch of people from SASL, Roger DeAngelis, Richard DeVenzia, and Bart all were kind enough to not only sort of help me learn DOSUBL on SASL, but also to review and give feedback on the paper, as were Rick Langston, who wrote DOSUBL, and Russ Tyndall, who now supports DOSUBL from SAS, now that Rick is retired. They were both really helpful. And then when I thought about how to try to do this, my first thought was to do it like an animated talk. If you don't know Russ Lavery's name, he's a phenomenal SAS trainer. We've been lucky to have him present at BASUG. He's phenomenal. He's got a whole series of what he calls animated guide talks, where he uses PowerPoint animations to illustrate things like the macro language with code going to the macro processor, or SQL, or regular expression parsing, or what have you. And when I called up or emailed Russ to ask, say, hi, could you teach me a little bit about how to animate PowerPoint? Russ said yes, set up a Zoom, and showed me, some of his tricks. So I'm grateful to Russ and all of these people who helped. If you got questions or feedback, I'm happy to get, hopefully you got a few minutes for Q&A now, but happy to get emails or see you on SASL or anything, because I think the DOSUBL is really interesting, and definitely open, as I said, to the idea that I might be wrong about some of what I've deduced. I think we need, as a community, to keep on playing with it and keep on working on it. So thanks for your time. Thanks, Bart.
Thank you, Quentin. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful talk. We've got some questions, but before I start to read them, just a few remarks. First of all, I'm very, very happy we have you here presenting this talk, because this is the very talk I wish we have on Polish SAS Users Group meetings, and in general SAS Users Groups, by users for users, right? We explore SAS, we share what we explored. That for me is the ultimate way of doing SAS talks. Second thing is that you said that you are not an expert in this field. I do not agree. I think it was Niels Bohr who said that an expert is a person who makes all possible mistakes in a very particular area. So basically, I think you spend with this subject so much time. You explore it. You encountered all those errors that you are an expert in the field.
Well, I've definitely made a lot of mistakes with DOSUBL, so that's that part of it is true. Thank you. I haven't heard that before from Niels Bohr.
I think you are an expert in this field. Next thing, because you discussed, I remember we had multiple discussions about DOSUBL on SASL. And not only this about macroscopy, I remember we had some how to pronounce the DOSUBL, how it should be pronounced, how it's constructed, and I remember that there's this video in which Rick Langston explains the DOSUBL, and he said do submit line. That was the original phrase which creates the name. And I also you said at the beginning about the showing that there is a side session. I think there's a quite simple way with using this SAS sys index macro variable, which shows you how many shows the number of macros which were executed in the current SAS session. If you run this in the main session, it increases by one with each macro. But when you put a DOSUBL inside the macro, it prints out 0. So it's like restarting the index. And this goes very well with the question which we have here. John asked the question. Well, in fact, two questions. Can a side session create its own libraries? And the second one, can it change global system option?
Yeah. So yes, well, yes to both in a way. So see, the side session is not like totally independent of your main session, right? So one thing I know from my testing so far is, right, it's got the same work library. For example, you only get one work library. So if you create a data set in your side session, that work data set could collide with a work data set in your main session. Yes, I don't know that I've done it, but I'm going to say yes anyway, that you're free to run the live name statement in your side session, and it'll create a new live ref and do its whole, and it will work. Do I know if you create a new live ref in the side session, when DOSUBL goes away, would that live ref still exist in your, would that come back to your main session?
It won't. It won't.
It won't. All right, so there you go. So that's an example of, you can create this live ref, but clearly that means that wherever SAS stores live refs, and I don't know where that is, right? I mean, is clearly being stored in its own spot for live refs for the side session, not sharing the resource with the main session. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Can you change options in your side session? Yes. So you can run an option statement in your side session code. It will change the options. And I don't think I've tested it recently with the current version of DOSUBL. I know that when I first started with it back in, like, M94, M2 or 3, M3, I guess, there were definitely options that you could change in the side session that would also then come back to your main session. And there were other options you could change in the side session and they wouldn't come back to your main session. So it's one that I think needs more testing. If I was going to do a more thorough paper about DOSUBL, it's like, I started with macro variables because that was really interesting to me and I thought that was the magic. But before I used DOSUBL with too much production stuff, options would probably be next on my list to go through, doing a whole like proc opt save or whatever to save everything, go into DOSUBL land, change some options, see how they compare, come back, see how they compare, or set options in your main session, go to DOSUBL and see the DOSUBL session even start with those same options, or did it have its own sort of clean new options based on the config.sas. I know that Rick worked on it because it changed over time from M3 to M later, but I don't know now exactly which of the options come and get inherited and don't.
Yeah, I love this feature of DOSUBL that I'm able to turn off nodes and source. When I'm running SAS code in the DOSUBL, I just write options, no nodes, no source, and there's nothing from this inside session is printed into the log. So it's quiet, and the options in the main session are not changed at the same moment. Next question was, is from Alan, and the question is, what are you finding on the performance issues with DOSUBL?
I was going to tell Bart, hey Bart, if there's no questions, you should ask why is DOSUBL so slow, right? So yeah, so that's all I have to say, right? So DOSUBL is very slow. So as opposed to say call execute, right? But then on reflection, like, I think it's fair that DOSUBL is slow, right? Like, if you think about call execute, what's it doing? Use call execute, read in a data set, and create the code for 100 data sets, maybe, or whatnot, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But all call execute is doing there is reading some data and writing some code and putting it on the input stack for SAS to process. That's very easy. It's not hard work. SAS knows how to read data and write code. It's been doing that for 40 years or what have you, right? Call execute isn't actually executing anything. Versus DOSUBL, if you use DOSUBL as a call execute replacement, it's doing a ton more work. Because if you're reading that control data set with whatever I said, 40 obs, DOSUBL doesn't create one side session. DOSUBL creates 40 side sessions. I mean, each iteration of the loop, DOSUBL gets executed, it creates a side session, runs code, and destroys the side session, more or less. The second time through the loop, it does that again. So in order to enable this magic that it does, it's not surprising on reflection, I think, that it's expensive to create this side session and then shut it down, right? I mean, it takes on my little PC plenty of time for SAS to start up. It's not quite doing all of that work, but it's doing a good chunk of that work every time you execute DOSUBL.
Yes, yes.
But
Exactly.
it's definitely worth knowing that, yes, it's definitely noticeably slower than call execute or macro. So if all you need to do is generate code, you don't need DOSUBL. But if you want to execute code, it's sometimes worth the price.
Yeah, the answer. I've got this my like private golden rule for DOSUBL. Do loops work good in DOSUBL, but DOSUBL don't work good in loops, basically,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So yeah, there's also this cool feature that when you compile a macro in the inside the DOSUBL, it will create separate macro catalog. The side session is able to use this macro, but the main session cannot see it. That's also quite interesting feature.
Yeah, you pointed that one out on SASL, the side session. So if you got work.sas macro, right, or if they changed an EG or whatever, but then the side session creates its work.sas macro 2 or something like that, right? And the side session can see the macro. It can see the first one though, which is really good, right? So the side session can see compiled macros from your main catalog, and then it can create its own macros. But right, those macros that it compiles, though, won't be available to the main session because I think you told me, Bart, I don't think it literally deletes that second macro catalog, but effectively when DOSUBL ends executing, that catalog is not usable anymore. Yeah. I think it waits until it doesn't actually delete the file. I think it's overwritten the next time probably.
Yeah. I see Russ has some points here. Russ, I turned on the microphone, so if you want to unmute yourself, you can do it if you wish.
Well, first off, congratulations. That was amazing. You saved us hundreds of hours of work. And it's just a comment on I think each SAS session, if I'm running multiple SAS sessions, wants to grab 2 gigs by default. And maybe that overhead of grabbing 2 gigs is one of the reasons why it doesn't work in loops or why it's slow.
That's interesting. I wonder, so that, first of all, thanks, Russ. I didn't know you were there, and I hope you were here for the thank you there. Really, thank you for your generosity in helping with the animations. I don't know. That would be interesting to test to see, like, if you change that M size option or whatever it is in your config, like, would that somehow speed things up for DOSUBL? Like, are those config options even sort of honored by DOSUBL? The side session is one question, and if they are, that actually might be a way to try to speed it up if that's part of the startup costs. Yeah, we should ask Rick about that, or just try it out.
Or the other Russ. Russ Tyndall.
Oh, well, the other, yeah, the other Russ Tyndall. Yep. Yeah, fair enough. Exactly. I've got to stop bothering retired SAS developers, right? So at some point.
Yeah, but, it's our passion, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Guys, yeah. Alan wrote that he has like circa about 600 milliseconds per invocation from his experience.
Half a second? Yeah, sure. That sounds right.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, guys. So one more time, Quentin, thank you very much for this talk. It's really great, and I think your call for writing more papers about DOSUBL, I second that. I think that's very good call. That's very good call for papers.
Exactly.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Bart. This was really fun. I'll hang out for the chat afterwards. So
yes,
thanks
exactly.
for having me.
I will stop recording now, I think.